In November of 1952, a man who ran a hamburger stand at the foot of a mountain in California walked into the desert with a handful of friends. He came back and told the world he had just shaken hands with a being from Venus. Within 3 years, he had sold 200,000 books. He was lecturing to packed auditoriums across 2 continents. People were handing him cash on the spot, just to sit in a room and hear him talk. And by the time anyone seriously investigated what he was actually claiming, it was too late. The story had already become bigger than the man who invented it. His name was George Adamski, and what he built wasn't a discovery. It was a machine for extracting money, devotion, and total belief out of ordinary people, using nothing but a story and a camera. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The exact same machine is still running today. Different names, different decades, same blueprint, repeated so precisely you could set your watch to it. I'm going to walk you through exactly how that blueprint works. Not to tell you whether aliens are real, that's not the question this video is answering. The question is much narrower, much more provable, and much more disturbing. Is the contact narrative itself, the specific story format of a being came to me, chose me, and gave me a message, built like a con? And if it is, why does it keep working, generation after generation, on intelligent people who would never fall for a street hustle? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to recognize this pattern in places that have nothing to do with UFOs at all. Let's start with the scale of what Adamski actually pulled off, because most people underestimate it. This wasn't a guy who got famous for one weird photo. Between 1953 and 1961, he published 3 books. The first 2 combined sold roughly 200,000 copies, and his work didn't stay in America, it spread internationally, especially in Japan, where it shaped how an entire generation pictured aliens in film and media for decades afterward. One man, one desert story, an immeasurable cultural footprint that outlived him by 60 years. That's not a hoax that fizzled out. That's a hoax that became infrastructure. Here's where it gets interesting. Adamski wasn't actually the first person to have this idea, but he was the first to go fully public with it, and once he did, something strange happened almost immediately. Other people started coming forward with the exact same kind of story. Contactees with names like Howard Menger, Daniel Fry, George Van Tassel, and Truman Bethurum all began describing their own meetings with what they called Space Brothers. Always benevolent, always spiritually advanced, always delivering some version of the same message. Humanity needs to grow up before it destroys itself. Pause on that for a second. If this was really independent contact with independent alien visitors, you'd expect wildly different stories, different appearances, different messages, different agendas. Instead, you got a kind of copy-paste spirituality. Every planet in the solar system was suddenly populated with physically perfect, spiritually enlightened beings who had already solved every problem Earth was struggling with. It read less like an encounter and more like a franchise. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. So here's the forbidden question. The one nobody in the contactee movement wanted asked out loud in 1953. What if the message was never really coming from outer space at all? What if it was coming from inside the room, tailored specifically to what a frightened, atomic-age audience most needed to hear? Let's look at what that audience actually needed. This is where the story stops being about spaceships and starts being about psychology. America in the early 1950s was living inside a very specific kind of dread. The bomb had already fallen on 2 cities. The Soviets had just detonated their own. Nobody knew if the next headline would be the end of everything. Into that exact climate walks a soft-spoken man who says he met a being who is not afraid, who has already survived the thing you fear, and who wants you to know it's going to be okay. That's not a random detail. That's the single most valuable emotional product you could possibly sell to that specific audience at that specific moment. Adamski didn't stumble into fame. He identified a wound and offered a bandage shaped exactly like it. Now here's the anomaly. The detail that shouldn't exist if this was a real encounter, but makes perfect sense if it was a performance. The most famous photograph Adamski ever took, the one that circulated in newspapers around the world and became, for a time, the most recognized UFO image on Earth, the alleged Venusian scout ship, was examined by skeptics almost immediately. And what they noticed was almost comedic. It bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the top of a chicken brooder, a device used for warming newly hatched poultry. Not a spacecraft, a piece of farm equipment, photographed at the right angle, in the right light, by a man who needed the world to believe it was something else entirely. Wait, it gets stranger. This wasn't the only piece of evidence that later collapsed. In 1957, Adamski produced a letter, supposedly from an official inside the U.S. State Department, seemingly confirming that the government privately knew his contact story was true and was preparing to validate it publicly. He treated that letter as vindication for the rest of his life. Nearly 30 years later, in 1985, a UFO researcher revealed the letter had been a hoax from the start, not written by Adamski himself, but a fabrication he had eagerly, uncritically embraced because it told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Even the proof that the story was being covered up turned out to be manufactured. Here's where the government actually gets involved, and this is the part almost nobody mentions when they tell this story, because it's less exciting than aliens, but far more revealing. The U.S. Air Force did take Adamski seriously enough to investigate him. Captain Edward Ruppelt, the officer running Project Blue Book at the time, went undercover in civilian clothes to attend one of Adamski's lectures in person. What he wrote afterward wasn't a report on extraterrestrial evidence. It was closer to a case study in persuasion. Ruppelt concluded Adamski was a highly skilled con artist, using his UFO stories specifically to extract money from people who were eager to believe him, and he compared him directly to P.T. Barnum, the most famous showman hoaxer in American history. He noted that Adamski spoke softly, almost humbly, in a way that made his audience want to trust him, and that once he finished telling his story, listeners lined up to buy his photographs on the spot. That's not a description of a witness. That's a description of a salesman closing a room. Now let's escalate, because this is where the pattern stops being about one man and starts being about a repeatable formula, one that shows up over and over across 100 years of American religious and spiritual hucksterism, wearing a different costume every time. Every version of this scam follows the same four-step architecture. Step 1. Isolate the claim. The contact always happens alone, or with only a small circle of loyal witnesses, never in a way that can be independently verified by a skeptical outsider standing right there. Step 2. Deliver a message that is impossible to disprove and irresistible to believe, usually some version of, "You are special, chosen, and the truth is being hidden from everyone else." Step 3. Convert belief into loyalty before you convert it into money, because people who feel chosen defend the person who chose them, often more fiercely than the person defends himself. And step 4. When skeptics produce evidence against you, don't argue the evidence. Attack the skeptics as part of the cover-up. Adamski had a name for this exact tactic. He called it the Silence Group, a supposed powerful unnamed force actively working to suppress the truth of his contact with the Space Brothers. Notice what that move accomplishes. It doesn't just deflect criticism. It preloads every future piece of contrary evidence as proof of the conspiracy itself. That's not a side detail. That's the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. Here's why this actually matters to you personally, whether or not you have ever cared about UFOs for a single second in your life. That exact four-step architecture, isolate the claim, deliver an unfalsifiable chosen one message, convert belief into loyalty, frame all criticism as the enemy, is the identical structural skeleton used by financial cult leaders, multi-level marketing recruiters, and modern online gurus selling secret knowledge nobody else wants you to have. The costume changes. Sometimes it's a spaceship. Sometimes it's a hidden investment strategy. Sometimes it's a wellness secret the medical establishment is supposedly suppressing. The skeleton underneath is always the same, because it's not really about aliens, or money, or health. It's about exploiting one specific human need, the need to feel chosen, and the need to feel that you, uniquely, have access to a truth the rest of the world is too blind to see. Here's the twist that changes how you should read everything you just heard. It would be easy and comfortable to end this by saying Adamski was simply a liar and everyone who believed him was simply a fool. But that's too clean, and it lets you off the hook. Because the real reveal isn't that a con man fooled people. It's that the con only works on people who are already carrying something real fear, real grief, real longing for meaning, and Adamski's genius wasn't the photograph or the letter. It was recognizing, faster than anyone else in 1952, exactly what an atomic age America was starving for, and building a story shaped precisely to fill that hunger. The scam wasn't selling aliens. The scam was selling relief from dread, with aliens as the packaging. So here's the practical alert, the thing you can actually use. The contact narrative, in any costume, becomes dangerous the exact moment it stops being a story you're allowed to question and becomes a status you're not allowed to lose. Watch for that shift. If believing something starts to feel less like an opinion you hold and more like an identity you'd be devastated to have taken away from you, that's not a sign the story is true. That's the sign the structure has already closed around you. And here is the vital piece of advice, the one thing worth carrying out of this video. The strength of your emotional reaction to a claim tells you absolutely nothing about whether that claim is true. Adamski's audiences didn't fall for bad evidence. Ruppelt himself said people wanted to believe Adamski before he'd even finished his story. The conviction came first, and the evidence was just there to justify a decision the room had already made emotionally. The single most useful habit you can build, in ufology or investing or politics or your own inbox, is asking one plain question before you feel anything at all. What, specifically, would have to be true for this evidence to hold up under someone actively trying to disprove it? Not someone who wants to believe it. Someone who wants to break it. So, did George Adamski ever actually meet a being from Venus in the California desert in 1952? The honest answer, built on everything we've just walked through, is that we don't need aliens to explain a single part of his story. Every element, the ambiguous photograph, the isolated encounter, the unfalsifiable message, the fabricated confirmation letter, the enemy narrative used to deflect all scrutiny, is fully, completely explained by one recognizable, well-documented human pattern. A gifted storyteller who understood exactly what a frightened audience wanted to hear and gave it to them, one lecture at a time, for the rest of his life. But here's the question that should actually stay with you after this video ends. Adamski's version of this scam needed a hamburger stand, a mediocre camera, and word of mouth spreading through print magazines and community lecture halls, and it still built an international movement that outlived him by 6 decades. Now ask yourself what the exact same 4-step architecture is capable of doing today, with an algorithm instead of a lecture hall and a global audience instead of a parking lot in California. The contact narrative didn't disappear when Adamski died in 1965. It just found a faster way to travel. And somewhere in your feed, right now, it's probably already running. You just haven't recognized the costume yet.